The lecture hall fell silent when Cadet Mira Chen walked through the double doors at 9:47 hours, 17 minutes late. Every carapace, tendril, and sensor array turned toward her. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying something precious. In her gloved hands, cradled against her chest like an offering, was Instructor Vexthalan's head. The compound eyes still blinked, the mandibles still clicked, and somewhere in the back row, a Chlorinite student's translucent body flickered from confident yellow to terrified ultraviolet. No one had asked her why she was late. They were about to learn why humans never rush. 17 minutes earlier, the advanced xenobiology lecture had started without her. Mira had sent no message, offered no excuse. The empty seat in the third row, human-sized, slightly too small for most species, remained conspicuously vacant while Instructor Vexthalan began the day's lesson on parasitic neural symbiotes. The Krell to Mira's usual left had already made 3 jokes about human unreliability. The tall insectoid beside him, a Thrikesh named Zax, had clicked his approval each time. Typical mammalian disorganization, Zax said loud enough for the front rows to hear. His translator rendered the words with a patronizing lilt. Probably overslept or got distracted by something shiny. A ripple of laughter spread through the assembled cadets. 63 species represented in one room, and most of them had nodded along. Humans were a recent addition to the galactic concordance. They'd arrived with enthusiasm, decent engineering, and an unfortunate reputation for being soft, emotional. Slow to act when action was required. Mira had heard it all in her first semester at the Celestial Defense Academy on Tarvo's station. She'd learned to let the words slide off like rain on polymer plating. Her instructors had warned her it would be this way. Earth's application to the concordance had been contentious. 3 cycles of debate, 2 near ejections. Humans had finally been admitted on a probationary basis, and every cadet from Sol's system carried that weight. Instructor Vexthalan had paused mid-sentence when the mockery started. The Zyxari's segmented body coiled tighter around the lecture podium, crimson scales catching the overhead lights. "Focus," he'd hissed, though whether he meant to chastise the cadets or simply redirect attention was unclear. Vexthalan was old by Zyxari standards, 200 cycles, maybe more. His teaching style blended patience with sudden, sharp rebukes. Mira respected him. He'd never treated her differently for being human. The door had remained closed. The minutes had ticked past. At 9:40, a Chlorinite named Peltia had whispered something to her neighbor, and both had dissolved into bubbling laughter. Mira's absence had become the subtext of the entire lesson, a running joke that needed no punchline. No one had considered that she might have a reason, that perhaps humans measured urgency differently than species who'd evolved under gentler circumstances. Zax leaned back in his seat, thorax segments spreading wide in a posture of comfortable superiority. She'll come in with some excuse about traffic in the docking bays or a family emergency back on Earth. They're always so sentimental about their bloodlines. The Krell beside him, a broad, crystalline being named Reth, rumbled agreement. Or she'll claim equipment failure. Humans rely too much on their technology. When it breaks, they're helpless. More laughter. Even a few of the quieter species joined in. Mira had made no enemies here, but she'd made no close allies either. Humans were curiosities, interesting for their adaptability but suspect for their slowness to integrate into the rigid hierarchies most species preferred. The academy had been designed for beings who respected strength, speed, and certainty. Humans offered none of those in obvious ways. Instructor Vexthalan had resumed the lesson on neural symbiotes, describing the way certain parasites could override host motor functions while leaving cognitive abilities intact. His voice had grown more animated as he detailed a case study from the Vrel colonies, where an entire research station had been compromised. The symbiotes entered through microabrasions, he explained, bonding to the brainstem within hours. Victims remained aware, trapped inside bodies they no longer controlled. Zax had raised a foreclaw. Instructor, could such a parasite affect a human? Vexthalan's eyes had glittered. An excellent question. Human neurology is unique. Their prefrontal cortex is disproportionately developed compared to most species. This creates both vulnerabilities and resistances we're still mapping. But they'd panic, wouldn't they? Zax pressed. Humans are prone to emotional volatility. A symbiote override would send them into fight or flight response. Perhaps, Vexthalan had said carefully, or perhaps their emotional volatility would work differently than you assume. The conversation had moved on, but the implication had hung in the air. Humans were predictable. Humans were soft. Humans could be dismissed. At 9:45, the door chime had sounded, a soft tone barely audible over the hum of climate control systems. Instructor Vexthalan had glanced toward the entrance, mandibles parting slightly. Enter. The doors hadn't opened. Instead, a second chime, then a third. Zax had snorted. She can't even operate a door mechanism. Reth had joined the laughter this time. Others followed. The mockery had reached a crescendo, 63 voices blending into a chorus of casual cruelty. They hadn't meant to be vicious, exactly, just superior, comfortable in their assumptions. Then the doors had slid open and Mira had stepped through. She wore her standard-issue cadet uniform, the gray and blue polymer tight across her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, though a few strands had come loose around her temples. She was shorter than most cadets, compact in the way Earthborn humans often were. Her skin was pale beneath the station's artificial lighting, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but it was what she carried that stopped every conversation mid-syllable. Instructor Vexthalan's head, severed cleanly at the base of the neck, rested in her gloved hands. The scales still held their crimson sheen. The compound eyes still tracked movement, though sluggishly. The mandibles clicked twice, then fell still. Mira walked to the front of the room with measured steps. She placed the head gently on the instructor's podium, positioning it so the eyes faced the class. Then she turned to face the assembled cadets. Her expression was calm, not cold exactly, but removed in the way someone might look when performing a necessary but unpleasant task. "I apologize for my tardiness," she said, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. There was a situation in Sector 7 that required immediate attention. Zax's forelegs scraped against the floor. Pelsh's translucent body had gone completely colorless. Reth sat frozen, crystalline structure refracting light in 1,000 directions. Mira gestured to the head. As Instructor Vexthalan was explaining, neural symbiotes can override motor function while preserving cognitive awareness. What he didn't mention is that Zyxari physiology allows the head to remain conscious for approximately 43 minutes after decapitation. I've kept it viable for the last 17. The mandibles clicked again. One compound eye swiveled to focus on Mira. The mouth parts worked, but no sound emerged. The vocal structures required the rest of the body to function. Mira met the eye steadily. "The instructor has been compromised since 6:20 hours this morning." The symbiote entered through a ventilation duct in his quarters and began override protocols while he slept. By the time he regained consciousness, he'd already sent 3 coded distress signals to security. I intercepted them during my morning network sweep. She pulled a small datapad from her belt and placed it beside the head. I tracked him to the sub-level maintenance tunnels where the symbiote was attempting to access the station's life support controls. Standard protocol would have been to alert security and wait for a containment team. Zax found his voice. "Then why didn't you?" Mira's gaze shifted to him. "Because humans don't measure urgency by protocols, we measure it by outcomes." She tapped the datapad, bringing up a schematic of the station's lower levels. The symbiote had already begun altering atmospheric mix in 3 residential sectors. Another 4 minutes, and it would have rendered those areas uninhabitable for 17 species currently housed there. Waiting for containment would have meant casualties. Pelsh's body flickered from colorless to a pale, sickly green. "So you killed the instructor?" "I saved him," Mira corrected. Zyxari regeneration allows for full body regrowth from the head if preserved properly. The symbiote was bonded to his spinal column. Removing the head severed that connection while keeping his consciousness intact. She gestured to the head again. The eyes blinked slowly, deliberately. 3 blinks in rapid succession, a Zyxari affirmative signal. Mira continued. "I spent the last 17 minutes ensuring the symbiote colony was fully neutralized, documenting the contamination site and transporting the instructor's head to medical. They'll begin regeneration procedures within the hour." Reth's voice came out as a low rumble. You carried his head across half the station?" "Yes." Mira's tone remained level. "I prioritized his consciousness over aesthetics. The head needed to remain upright and stable to preserve brain function. Running would have caused unnecessary jostling." Zax's mandibles worked soundlessly. Mira watched him for a moment, then addressed the entire class. You assumed I was late because humans are disorganized, sentimental, slow to act. You were partially correct. I did prioritize emotional factors. I chose to ensure Instructor Vexthalan remained aware and calm rather than rushing and potentially causing panic or brain damage. She paused, letting the words settle. But you were wrong about what that means. Humans don't rush because we understand that speed without precision is just chaos with momentum. The lecture hall remained silent, 63 species, and not one of them moved. Mira stood at the front of the room, hands now empty, and faced the assembled cadets with the same calm she'd carried since entering. The shock hadn't worn off yet. She could see it in the way Zax's antennae had gone completely still, how Pelsh's bioluminescence flickered erratically, how even Reth's usually confident posture had contracted inward. They were waiting for something. An outburst maybe, tears. Some display of the emotional volatility they'd been taught to expect from humans. She gave them none of it. Instead, she pulled up the holographic display built into the podium, bypassing the head with careful precision. The air above the desk shimmered, resolving into a three-dimensional map of Tarvos Station's lower decks. Red markers indicated contamination zones. Blue showed her route from the residential sector to the maintenance tunnels and back. At 6:23 hours, Mira began, her voice steady and methodical, I received an automated alert on my personal network monitor. I keep tracking protocols running on all station systems, standard practice for anyone trained in Earth's cyberdefense programs. A Thrikesh in the back row raised a foreclaw hesitantly. Why would a cadet monitor station systems? Because Earth's admission to the Concordance is probationary, Mira said simply. We're expected to prove our value. I chose to prove it by being useful. She expanded the hologram, showing data streams and communication logs. The alert was unusual. 3 distress codes transmitted in rapid succession, all using Zyxari emergency frequencies, but they were disguised within routine maintenance reports. Most monitoring systems would have filtered them out as background noise. Zax found his voice again, though it came out rough. But you didn't, no. Mira traced a finger through the holographic data, highlighting the relevant codes. Humans have a pattern recognition advantage in certain contexts. We evolved as persistence hunters. We're very good at spotting anomalies over time. The codes were subtle, but the repetition stood out. She pulled up the next layer of data. I ran a trace and identified the source. Instructor Vexthalan's quarters. I attempted direct communication but received no response. That's when I realized something was actively preventing him from making contact. Pelsh's voice was barely a whisper. You could have alerted security then. I could have, Mira agreed. But response time for a Code 7 biological contamination is typically 12 to 15 minutes. Station protocol requires containment teams to suit up, verify the threat, and establish perimeter protocols before engaging. She met Pelsh's eyes. I pulled the instructor's biometric data. His heart rate was elevated but stable. Respiration was controlled. He was conscious and aware but unable to communicate. That meant the symbiote was in early override stages. It had motor control but hadn't yet suppressed his higher functions. Mira tapped the podium and the hologram shifted to show the maintenance tunnel systems. I tracked his movement through security feeds. He was heading for the atmospheric control nexus in sublevel 9. Symbiotes of this class typically have a hive directive. They seek to create optimal conditions for reproduction. For Vrel neural symbiotes, that means high humidity and elevated carbon dioxide levels. Reth leaned forward, crystalline body refracting the hologram's light into rainbow patterns. You identified the species? From the override pattern, yes. Mira highlighted several nodes on the map. Vrel symbiotes move in stages. First, they secure motor control, then they isolate the host from communication. Finally, they alter the environment to support colony growth. Instructor Vexthalan's trajectory matched that pattern exactly. She paused, glancing at the severed head on the podium. The eyes tracked her movement, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing. I had a choice: wait for security and risk environmental contamination, or intervene directly with the tools I had available. Zax's wings rustled. What tools could a cadet possibly have for neural symbiote extraction? Mira reached into her jacket and pulled out a compact medical kit, no larger than her palm. Earth doesn't have neural symbiotes, but we have parasites, bacteria, and viruses that have shaped our medical technology for millennia. This kit contains nanoscalpels, coagulant foam, and a stasis field generator. She set the kit on the podium beside the head. Zyxari anatomy allows for decapitation survival if executed properly. The neck structure has 7 major nerve clusters, but only 3 are critical for maintaining head consciousness. A precise cut above the 4th vertebrae severs motor control from the body while preserving cognitive function. The room was silent. Mira continued, her tone never wavering. I caught up to Instructor Vexthalan in sublevel 9 at 6:31 hours. He was attempting to access the atmospheric controls. I couldn't communicate verbally. The symbiote had full control of his auditory processing, but Zyxari biology includes a secondary visual cortex that remains independent. I used hand signals. She demonstrated fingers moving in a deliberate pattern. I asked permission, 3 rapid gestures for threat, 2 for trust, 1 for cut. Pelsh's color shifted to a faint, horrified amber. He agreed. He blinked affirmative. Mira's voice remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. He understood what I was proposing. He understood the risk, and he trusted me to execute it correctly. She pulled up another hologram, this one showing anatomical diagrams of Zyxari physiology. The procedure took 4 minutes. Nanoscalpels cauterize as they cut, preventing blood loss. I severed the connection at the optimal point, then applied stasis foam to the head to preserve neural activity. The body collapsed immediately. The symbiote lost motor control when the spinal connection was severed. Mira gestured to the timeline on the display. I then spent 8 minutes securing the symbiote colony. They'd already begun spreading through the ventilation system. I used thermal charges to seal the ducts and applied broad-spectrum antibiotics to the affected areas. Station security arrived at 6:43 hours and took over containment. Zax stared at her. And you carried the head back yourself? Medical protocols required maintaining the head in an upright, stable position, Mira said. The stasis field generator runs on battery power. I had 47 minutes of charge. I calculated travel time at 15 minutes if I walked at standard pace, keeping the head level and minimizing motion. Running would have risked jostling the field and causing neural damage. She glanced at the head again. Instructor Vexthalan's consciousness had to be preserved with absolute precision. Speed would have been counterproductive. Reth's voice came out low and uncertain. You chose his awareness over efficiency? Yes. Mira's answer was immediate, because humans understand something most species seem to miss. Consciousness isn't a side effect of biology, it's the entire point. The words hung in the air. Mira turned off the hologram and faced the class fully. Her posture relaxed slightly, though her expression remained serious. You mocked me for being late, you assumed human limitations, and you were right about some of them. She counted off on her fingers. We're slow compared to Thrikesh, we're fragile compared to Krell. We're emotionally volatile compared to most species represented here. All of that is true. Her gaze swept across the room. But you missed what makes those traits advantages. We're slow because we think before we act. We're fragile because we've had to develop technology and cooperation to survive. And we're emotional because we value consciousness, ours and others, above almost everything else. Zax's wings buzzed softly. You risked your career, unauthorized medical intervention, ignoring security protocols. I followed human protocols, Mira interrupted. First, do no harm. Second, preserve life and consciousness above procedure. Third, accept the consequences. She picked up the medical kit and returned it to her jacket. Station security has already filed their report. I'll face a disciplinary hearing this afternoon. Possible outcomes include suspension, expulsion, or formal censure. I'm prepared for all of them. Pelsh's voice trembled. Was it worth it? Mira looked at the head on the podium. The compound eyes blinked slowly, 3 times, deliberate and clear. She smiled, just barely. Ask him in 43 minutes when his new body starts growing. The silence that followed was different from before, not shocked exactly. Something closer to understanding beginning to take root in uncertain soil. Mira checked her chronometer. I'm 17 minutes late. That means 17 minutes of lecture time lost. I apologize for the disruption. Reth rumbled something that might have been a laugh or a cough, I think. I think we learned more in the last 10 minutes than we would have in the scheduled lesson. Maybe, Mira said, but that's not for me to decide. She gestured to the empty seats. If anyone has questions about neural symbiote containment, Zyxari anatomy, or human decision-making protocols, I'll stay after class. Otherwise, I suggest we give Instructor Vexthalan some peace. He's earned it. No one moved, not yet. They were still processing, still recalibrating assumptions that had held firm for years, cycles, generations. The disciplinary hearing convened at 1400 hours in Conference Room 7, a sterile gray space designed for exactly this kind of uncomfortable bureaucracy. 3 adjudicators sat behind a curved desk, Commander Vol. A Krell with deep green crystalline facets, Administrator Chess, a Chlorani whose body currently pulsed an official bureaucratic blue, and Professor Kilthane, a human woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen more than one cadet face consequences. Mira stood at attention in the center of the room, hands clasped behind her back. She'd changed into her formal dress uniform, the one reserved for ceremonies and, apparently, career-ending hearings. The fabric felt stiff against her shoulders. She'd polished her boots until they reflected the overhead lights. Commander Vol spoke first, his voice resonating through the translation matrix. Cadet Mira Chen. You stand accused of 7 protocol violations: unauthorized medical intervention, failure to alert security in a timely manner, unauthorized access to instructor biometric data, unapproved use of nanosurgical equipment, deviation from containment protocols, unauthorized presence in restricted maintenance zones, and reckless endangerment of station personnel. He paused, letting each charge hang in the air. How do you respond? Guilty on all counts, sir. Mira's voice was steady, with context. Administrator Chess's body flickered toward an irritated yellow. Context does not excuse protocol violation, Cadet. Protocols exist to ensure safety and order. Your actions directly contravened established procedures. Yes, ma'am. Mira met the Chlorani's gaze, but the protocols were designed for species that prioritize hierarchy and process over immediate outcomes. Humans are newer to the concordance. Our protocols prioritize differently. Professor Kilthane leaned forward. Explain. Mira took a breath. Human emergency response training emphasizes triage. When faced with multiple threats, we assess which action will preserve the most life and consciousness in the shortest time. We're trained to act first and report second when seconds matter. That's reckless, Chess countered. It's adaptive, Mira replied. On Earth, we evolved in an environment where hesitation meant death. Not just individual death, extinction-level threats were constant. Ice ages, predators, disease, resource scarcity. We survived by making rapid decisions with incomplete information and accepting the consequences. Commander Vol's facets caught the light as he tilted his head. And you believe this justifies ignoring station protocols? No, sir. I believe it explains why I acted as I did. Mira straightened slightly. I'm not asking to be excused. I'm asking to be understood. Professor Kilthane's expression remained neutral, but her fingers drummed once against the desk. Walk us through your decision tree, Cadet, step by step. Mira nodded. At 6:23, I received the distress codes. First decision point, investigate or ignore. I investigated because the cost of a false negative, missing a real threat, outweighed the cost of a false positive. She continued, voice methodical. At 6:26, I confirmed the codes originated from Instructor Vexthalan's quarters. Second decision point, alert security or investigate personally. I chose personal investigation because response time would have been 12 to 15 minutes and the distress codes indicated awareness and urgency. Vol interrupted. You assumed you could respond faster than trained security. I assumed I could gather more information while they mobilized, Mira corrected. I sent a preliminary alert to security at 6:27, but I flagged it as investigation in progress rather than immediate response required. That was an error in judgment. Chess's color shifted toward a sharp, accusatory orange, an error that could have resulted in your death. Yes, ma'am, but would not have resulted in additional casualties. Mira kept her tone even. If I'd been wrong, security would have found my body and escalated appropriately. If I'd been right, which I was, I'd have gathered critical intelligence before they arrived. She paused. At 6:29, I located Instructor Vexthalan in the maintenance tunnels. Third decision point, attempt verbal intervention or physical intervention. The symbiote had motor control but not cognitive suppression. Verbal communication was impossible, but visual signals worked. Professor Kilthane asked, how did you confirm he understood? Zyxari's secondary visual cortex processes hand signals independently of the primary motor cortex, Mira said. I used basic gestures, threat, trust, cut. He responded with deliberate blinks, 3 rapid, then pause, then 3 more, standard affirmative in Zyxari nonverbal communication. Vol leaned back. You asked a compromised instructor for permission to decapitate him. Yes, sir. Mira's voice didn't waver, because consciousness matters. His consciousness mattered. I wasn't going to make that decision for him without consent. Administrator Chess's color flickered uncertainly between orange and pale yellow. That's highly irregular. It's human, Culthane said quietly. She looked at Mira. Continue, cadet. Mira nodded. Fourth decision point, execute the procedure or wait for medical support. Medical response time for sublevel 9 is approximately 20 minutes. Instructor Vexthalan had already begun accessing atmospheric controls. I estimated 4 minutes until he succeeded in altering life support parameters. She pulled out her datapad and projected a timeline. 4 minutes of atmospheric contamination would have resulted in respiratory distress for 17 species in 3 residential sectors. Estimated casualties, between 12 and 30 individuals, depending on response speed and individual health factors. Vol studied the projection, and you believed you could prevent this. I believed I had the tools, the knowledge, and the consent, Mira said. So yes, I believed I could try. Trying isn't succeeding, Chess pointed out. No, ma'am, but not trying is definitely failing. Mira met her gaze. I've studied Earth's history extensively. We have thousands of years of records showing what happens when people with the ability to act choose not to because they're waiting for permission. The casualties stack up fast. Professor Culthane's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Fifth decision point, post-procedure protocol, Mira said. I had Instructor Vexthalan's head preserved in a stasis field. Fifth decision point, deliver to medical immediately via emergency transport or carry manually at controlled pace. Emergency transport would have been faster, 7 minutes versus 15, but would have subjected the head to acceleration forces and potential jostling. She gestured to the timeline again. Zyxari neural tissue is resilient but not invulnerable. Rapid acceleration could have caused microhemorrhaging in the preserved brain tissue. I calculated that 15 minutes of stable level transport posed less risk than 7 minutes of emergency protocols. So you walked across half the station, Vol said slowly, carrying your instructor's severed head because you determined it was safer than calling for emergency medical transport. Yes, sir. The room fell silent. Chess's color had shifted to an uncertain pale blue. Vol's facets had dimmed slightly, refracting less light. Professor Culthane watched Mira with an expression that might have been approval or might have been resignation. It was hard to tell. Commander Vol finally spoke. Cadet Chen, your actions were technically violations of 7 separate protocols. They were also, by every measurable outcome, successful. Instructor Vexthalan is currently undergoing regeneration in Medical Bay 4. Prognosis is excellent. The symbiote colony has been fully contained and eliminated. Atmospheric contamination was prevented. 0 casualties resulted from this incident. He paused. However, success does not excuse procedure. The protocols exist for reasons that extend beyond individual situations. If every cadet decided to override established guidelines based on personal judgment, we would have chaos. I understand, sir. Mira kept her posture rigid. I accept whatever consequences you determine. Administrator Chess leaned forward. The question before us is whether those consequences should include termination of your cadetship. Mira's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Professor Culthane cleared her throat. If I may offer perspective, she waited until the other 2 adjudicators nodded, then continued. Earth's admission to the Concordance has been complicated. We're the newest member species, and we come from a cultural background that prioritizes individual initiative over collective protocol. This creates friction. She looked at Mira, but it also creates value. Cadet Chen acted in a way that no other species represented at this academy would have considered. She prioritized consciousness, consent, and rapid adaptation over established procedure. That's not recklessness. That's a fundamentally different approach to problem solving. Vol rumbled thoughtfully. Are you suggesting we excuse the violations? I'm suggesting we recognize them as cultural differences rather than disciplinary failures, Culthane said, and that we use this incident as a teaching opportunity rather than a punishment framework. Chess's color shifted to a cautious green. What kind of teaching opportunity? Culthane smiled. Cadet Chen will document her entire decision-making process, including risk assessment, protocol deviation justifications, and outcome analysis. This documentation will be added to the Academy curriculum as a case study in adaptive emergency response. she turned to Mira. You'll also develop a training module on human triage protocols and present it to your entire cohort. If other species are going to work alongside humans in emergency situations, they need to understand how we think. Mira blinked. Ma'am? Additionally, Kulthane continued, addressing the other adjudicators now, Cadet Chen will be placed on formal probation for the remainder of the semester. Any further protocol violations will result in immediate expulsion. But her actions today, while unauthorized, prevented casualties and demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive thinking we need in Concordance Defense Forces. Commander Vole considered this. His facets brightened slowly, refracting light in complex patterns. A compromise, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, educational value extracted, consequences applied but not career-ending. Exactly, Kulthane said. Shess's color had shifted to a thoughtful teal. I find this acceptable, assuming Cadet Chen agrees to the terms. All three adjudicators looked at Mira. She stood very still, processing. Probation was serious. One mistake and she'd be sent home, Earth's probationary status possibly damaged further by her failure, but she'd still be a cadet, she'd still have a chance. I agree, she said quietly. Thank you, don't thank us yet, Vole said. You have a training module to develop and an entire cohort to convince that humans aren't dangerously reckless. That's going to be harder than carrying a severed head across the station. Despite herself, Mira smiled. Yes, sir. The hearing ended at 14:47 hours. Mira walked out of Conference Room 7 with her cadetship intact and a new assignment that would probably be harder than any combat simulation. But she was still here, still part of the Academy, still representing humanity in a galaxy that was slowly, uncertainly beginning to understand what that meant. 3 days later, Mira stood before her entire cohort in the Academy's main assembly hall. 216 cadets from 63 species filled the tiered seating, and every single one of them was watching her with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, or outright hostility. The room smelled like 100 different atmospheric preferences barely compatible under one environmental system, sulfur and ozone and something sweet that made her eyes water. She'd spent 72 hours preparing this presentation. Professor Kulthane had reviewed it twice, suggesting only minor adjustments to terminology. Let them hear your voice, she'd said, not mine. Mira activated the holoprojector. A three-dimensional timeline appeared above her head, showing the events from 6:23 to 9:47 hours on the day of the incident. She took a breath and began. 3 days ago, many of you watched me walk into advanced xenobiology carrying Instructor Vexthaland's head. You've heard the official report. Today, I'm going to explain why I made the choices I did and what those choices reveal about human cognition. Zack sat in the third row, antennae perfectly still. Pelsha occupied a space near the back, her translucent body a cautious yellow. Reth was front and center, crystalline structure refracting the hologram into rainbow fragments across his neighbors. Mira highlighted the first decision point on the timeline. Humans call this triage from a French word meaning to sort. It originated in military medicine during Earth's Napoleonic Wars. Field surgeons had to decide rapidly which wounded soldiers to treat first when resources were limited. She expanded the concept visually, showing 3 categories. Category 1, immediate treatment required and likely to survive with intervention. Category 2, delayed treatment acceptable, stable condition. Category 3, treatment unlikely to change outcome. Avrel in the middle section raised a tendril. This seems cold, deciding who lives and dies based on efficiency. It seems cold until you're the surgeon, Mira replied. Then it becomes the difference between saving 30 soldiers or losing 50 because you spent too long trying to save one who wouldn't make it anyway. She let that settle, then continued. Human emergency response evolved from this principle. When faced with multiple threats or limited resources, we assess rapidly. Not perfectly, we accept that we'll make mistakes, but fast enough to act while action still matters. The timeline advanced to the second decision point. When I received Instructor Vexthaland's distress codes, I ran an unconscious triage assessment. Threat level high, response time if I followed protocol 12 to 15 minutes, potential casualties if the threat escalated unknown but significant, cost of investigation, my time, possible danger to myself, benefit, actionable intelligence and possibly faster intervention. Reth's voice rumbled through the hall. You gambled with your life. Yes, Myra acknowledged, but humans gamble differently than most species. We evolved as pursuit hunters on a planet where almost everything was faster, stronger, or more venomous than us. We survived by taking calculated risks and accepting that sometimes we'd fail. She pulled up statistics: human mortality rates through history, extinction events survived, population bottlenecks overcome. At one point, approximately 70,000 Earth years ago, human population dropped to maybe 10,000 individuals. We nearly went extinct. But we didn't, because the ones who survived were the ones willing to take risks when the alternative was guaranteed death. Pelsh's voice was quiet. You're saying recklessness is genetic. I'm saying adaptability is genetic, Myra corrected. Recklessness implies lack of thought. What I did was highly thought out. I just thought faster than most species consider safe. She advanced the timeline to the decapitation decision. This is where human cognition diverges most sharply from concordance norms. I asked Instructor Vexthalan for permission before cutting off his head. A ripple of uncomfortable sounds passed through the assembly. Myra continued. Most species would have either waited for proper medical support or made the executive decision on the instructor's behalf. Humans do neither. We prioritize consent and consciousness even in crisis. Zax leaned forward. Why, if you believed it was the correct action, why waste time asking? Because he's a person, not a problem, Myra said simply. His consciousness, his autonomy, those don't disappear just because he's compromised. Humans have a long, ugly history of making medical decisions for people without their consent. We've learned, very painfully, that preserving life without preserving dignity isn't actually saving anyone. She highlighted the hand signals on the timeline, demonstrating them again. Threat, trust, cut. 3 concepts that formed a complete question. There's a threat. Do you trust me to cut? His response was 3 deliberate blinks. Affirmative. He understood the stakes and he chose to consent. Professor Kilthane watched from the side of the hall, her expression unreadable. Myra wondered if she was doing this right, if she was explaining it correctly, if any of this was getting through. Then Reth spoke again. You gave him agency? Yes, Myra said. Even when he couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't control his own body, I gave him a choice, because that's what consciousness means to humans, not just awareness, autonomy. She advanced to the final timeline segment. And then I carried his head across the station at a walk because rushing would have caused neural damage. This is where human time perception comes in. A new visualization appeared: comparative reaction speeds across species. Thrikesh topped the chart, followed by Krell, then a dozen others before humans appeared near the bottom third. We're not fast, Myra admitted. Compared to most of you, we're sluggish, but we're persistent. She pulled up endurance data. Humans can run for hours. We can track prey across vast distances over days. We overheat slower than most mammals because we evolved sophisticated cooling systems, sweat glands across our entire body. What we lack in speed, we make up for in duration. Zax's wings buzzed. What does that have to do with carrying a severed head? Everything, Myra said. Because humans don't measure success by how fast we reach the goal. We measure it by whether we reach it at all with our values intact. She turned off the timeline and faced the assembly directly. Speed would have endangered Instructor Vexthalan's neural tissue, so I walked, slowly, carefully, maintaining level position and minimal movement. It took 15 minutes. He remained conscious the entire time because I prioritized his awareness over efficiency. Pelsh's color had shifted to a pale, thoughtful green. You chose consciousness over speed. Always, Myra confirmed. That's the core difference between human triage and concordance protocol. You optimize for outcome, we optimize for outcome and dignity simultaneously. She pulled up one final image, a photograph from Earth, black and white, showing a human surgeon working in a field hospital during what the caption identified as World War II. This surgeon, Myra said, performed over 3,000 operations under battlefield conditions. His survival rate was notable not because he worked fast, but because he worked carefully even when speed seemed critical. She zoomed in on the surgeon's face, tired, focused, but not frantic. He understood something humans have known for millennia. Panic kills more people than slowness. Rushing causes mistakes. The best emergency response is controlled urgency, fast enough to matter, slow enough to do it right. The assembly hall was quiet now, not the shocked silence of 3 days ago, but something more thoughtful. Receptive, maybe. Myra took a breath. I'm not asking you to agree with my choices. I'm asking you to understand the framework I used to make them, because humans are part of the concordance now and we're going to keep making decisions that seem strange or reckless to you. But they're not reckless, they're just human. She deactivated the hollow projector. Questions? Hands, claws, tendrils, and appendages rose throughout the hall. Mira pointed to a small, furred creature in the back, a myxtile, she thought, though she was still learning all the species. If you had it to do over, the myxtile asked in a high, piping voice, would you change anything? Mira considered. I'd send a clearer alert to security, flag it as active emergency instead of investigation in progress. That was a communication error that could have caused problems if things had gone wrong. Another question, this one from a tall, willowy being with too many joints. Do all humans think like you? No, Mira said honestly. Human cognition varies enormously. We have over 8 billion individuals on Earth and we disagree about almost everything. What I showed you today is one approach, emergency medical triage combined with consent ethics and persistence hunting psychology. Other humans would have made different choices. Zack stood, his posture more respectful than she'd ever seen it. What do you want us to learn from this? Mira met his eyes. That when you work alongside humans, we're going to prioritize consciousness and consent even when it seems inefficient. We're going to ask permission before making decisions that affect others' bodies. And we're going to move at the pace that preserves dignity, not the pace that looks impressive. She paused. And in return, I'm learning that your approaches have value too. Krell's structural thinking prevents catastrophic oversights. Thrikesh's rapid response saves lives in situations where my careful pace would fail. Chlorinai collective decision-making catches blind spots, individual judgment misses. She spread her hands. We're all different. That's the point of the concordance, isn't it? Not to make everyone think alike, but to combine different strengths? Commander Vol's voice came from the back of the hall. Mira hadn't noticed him enter. Well said, Cadet Chen. He moved down the aisle, his crystalline body refracting light in complex patterns. This presentation will be added to the core curriculum. All cadets will study it as part of xenopsychology training. He paused beside her. You're still on probation. One more protocol violation and you're gone. Yes, sir, but you're also exactly the kind of cadet the concordance needs. His facets brightened. Dismissed. The assembly dispersed slowly, cadets from dozens of species filing out in clusters. Several approached Mira Reth to offer a formal Krell gesture of respect, Pelsha to ask for a copy of her research notes, others to simply nod or acknowledge her with their species equivalent of a thank you. Zax was last. He stood before her, antennae moving in careful patterns. I mocked you, he said finally, for being late, for being human. I was wrong. You weren't wrong about the facts, Mira said. I was late, I am human, you just misunderstood what those facts meant. His mandibles clicked, a Thrikesh laugh Professor Kulthane had taught her. I'll try to make fewer assumptions. Same, Mira said, and meant it. 47 hours after Mira had walked into advanced xenobiology carrying her instructor's head, she received a message on her personal comm. The sender was listed as Vexthalan, Instructor Vexthalan, reporting from Medical Bay 4. She opened it immediately. Cadet Chen, I am told you are responsible for my continued existence. My regeneration is proceeding ahead of schedule. The medical staff attributes this to the exceptional preservation of my cranial tissue during transport. They inform me you carried my head manually across half the station to ensure neural stability. I have 3 responses to this. First, thank you. Consciousness without agency is a particular kind of nightmare. You gave me both. Second, you violated 7 protocols and terrified an entire cohort of cadets. This was pedagogically valuable but institutionally irregular. I am obligated to note this for the record. Third, I blinked affirmative when you asked permission. I want that documented. You did not make this choice for me. I chose to trust you and my trust was rewarded with continued existence. When my regeneration completes in approximately 36 hours, I will return to teaching. I look forward to seeing you in class, on time, preferably, though I now understand that human definitions of on time include preserving consciousness at sustainable pace. A final note, the pancakes in the station commissary are adequate. I am told humans have strong opinions about breakfast foods. Perhaps we might discuss this sometime. Respectfully, Instructor Vexthalan. Mira read the message 3 times, then saved it to her personal archive. Her eyes stung. Humans did that when emotions ran high, another inefficiency that somehow mattered. She typed a response. Instructor, you're welcome, and thank you for trusting me. I'll be on time for your next lecture, I promise. Also, the commissary pancakes are terrible. I'll bring my own recipe next time. Respectfully, Cadet Mira Chen. She hit send, then stood and walked to the window of her small quarters. Tarvo's station hung in orbit around a pale blue gas giant, and through the viewport she could see Earth in the distance, a small blue-green marble against the black. 63 species in the concordance. 8 billion humans on that distant planet, all learning to navigate a galaxy that didn't quite understand them yet. And Mira, standing here with her probation status and her training module assignment and her message from an instructor who trusted her with his literal head. It wasn't what she'd expected when she'd applied to the academy, but then humans specialized in adapting to the unexpected. She smiled, checked her chronometer, and headed for the commissary. She had a presentation to refine, protocols to study, and pancakes to drastically improve. Somewhere in the station, Instructor Vexthaland's body continued its regeneration. In 47 minutes, his consciousness would move from preserved head to newly grown form, and he'd walk again, talk again, teach again, because a human had asked permission, had moved slowly enough to preserve what mattered. Had carried his awareness across half a station at a pace that prioritized dignity over speed. The other species were learning what that meant, learning that humans measured urgency differently. That they'd arrived in the concordance with their own frameworks, their own values, their own understanding of what it meant to save a life. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the galaxy needed.